The Thin Man is the main antagonist in Little Nightmares 2, and after completing the game, many of us assumed we had him all figured out. But after weeks of digging through the game and official media, I think I may have just stumbled across a whole backstory of the Thin Man that no one else has yet discussed. So as usual, there's going to be spoilers for Little Nightmares 2 and other games and all of the media around it, so if you want to avoid spoilers in this video, I suggest that you click off now. So the most popular theory on the Thin Man is a pretty obvious one to see. The Thin Man pursues children around the Pale City for some reason, Mono defeats the Thin Man, then rescues 6, gets dropped and trapped in the signal tower, grows up alone, and either replaces or becomes the Thin Man. This is where the time loop or paradox theory comes into play. In order for there to be a Thin Man, we need a Mono. In order for there to be a Mono, we need a Thin Man. But as I have said many times in previous videos, the laws of physics are completely broken in the signal tower, so it's entirely possible that time is too. In this theory video, I'm going to offer an alternative theory, one that I have heard no one else talk about. That theory is that the Thin Man actually existed in the Pale City before the signal tower corruption. But before we delve too deeply into this theory, I have to establish a few key principles. Firstly, the city used to be normal, or at least much more normal than it is now. Secondly, the main antagonists in this game are displaying behaviour that they previously knew, or they copied from somewhere else. And finally, as I've already stated, time is not a linear construct in the Pale City, at least not anymore. We can theorise that the city used to be a normal place. After all, it's filled with things that don't seem to be used now, but were at some point. The school is full of children's backpacks and belongings that the porcelain children seem to have no interest in. The hospital is full of empty beds that look like they were once used, and the Pale City is full of discarded things that imply the city was once a fully functioning one. Electricity, food, postage, transport, all things a real city would need, yet the viewers take no notice of. So the city used to be normal. Now let's look at the behaviours of the main enemies in the game. They all seem to display behaviours that you would expect of their characters, just a little twisted. The teacher teaches her students. She disciplines them, she makes them sit at their desks, but she also prepares lessons. She even plays a piano at one point. However, the twisted part here is that her students aren't real. They don't seem to be able to learn all that well, which makes sense since they are literally empty-headed. But even then, the bullies do display some basic level of understanding of the world. It's just a little off. This one is trying to jab a key into the dead frog, presumably trying to make it move like a clockwork toy that we see all around the city. She has a basic grasp of understanding, but it's not quite right. The doctor also shows something similar in his behaviours. He tries to fix his patients, he just doesn't quite get it right. He attaches limbs in the wrong places, he uses a saw to chop them up, but you could easily see that he is demonstrating behaviours that real doctors would. Just once again, not quite right. We do see that the doctor washes his hands, and he even gets incredibly panicked when we turn off the life support for his patient. The hunter, well, hunts. He sets traps, he shoots at moving prey, he skins the things he catches, he even carries out taxidermy, yet just once again, not quite right. Now I promise this is very relevant to the Thin Man, but we need to establish this foundation for the theory. There are a number of ways you could explain these behaviours. First, these people used to be normal. The signal tower has corrupted them, but they are continuing to follow their basic instincts. The teacher teaches because that is embedded in her identity. She's almost an echo of her normal life. Again, a twisted version of what she used to be. The other way we could explain this is that the enemies are only acting out these roles. We see a bunch of evidence that things in this world are created. We see the taxidermy people, the porcelain children, the toys all over the place. It's possible that these enemies have been created. They are copying behaviour they've learned from somewhere else. This could explain why they don't quite get their roles right. Just like the frog girl, they only have a basic understanding. Maybe they even learnt these behaviours from a TV show, or as I've theorised in a previous video, they all are living out a TV show. You could also describe them as a pale imitation. So how does this relate to the Thin Man? Well, we could speculate that the Thin Man is also an echo of his former self, or he is copying the behaviour he learned from another Thin Man. I like the former more, and the reason why I like this idea is that we see that the Thin Man, just like all the other enemies of this game, seems to only display a set number of behaviours. He stalks through the city looking for children. He takes no interest in the viewers. For some reason, he kidnaps all the children and takes them to the signal tower, or the TV realm, however you want to look at it. So why? Why does he do this? To explain this, I need to look at a couple of areas in the game, but to really grasp what could be going on here, I will also need to compare this to the official artwork. One area that stood out to me in Little Nightmares 2 was the room next to the lift puzzle. The room where we grabbed the key for the elevator seemed significant on my first playthrough, but I couldn't figure out why. What was even more odd about this room though, was that right above it we found a glitching remains with a mattress on the floor, a bunch of pictures lying around, and then these bottles on the ceiling, one stuffed with a bird. It's possible that those hanging bottles are a reference to witch bottles that would be hung and hidden away to ward off witches, but maybe I'll cover that in another video. But what struck me about this room below was that it reminded me of a private investigator's office. Now at first I didn't really pay much attention to this, it was just a feeling that I got. But if you look around this room, you can see a bunch of files, pictures on the wall, notes, and an ashtray. Remember that ashtray. The pictures on the wall are very difficult to make out because they're so small. But one here looks like the ferryman, and this one looks like a child, maybe one of the bullies. Now you might say that this whole PI thing is a stretch, and honestly, it is. Except when you look at the Little Nightmares 2 official artwork, we actually do see a room that really looks like a PI's office. This time, the dead giveaway is the connected dots with the pictures. This screams PI to me. It could be police, but this seems much more like an office than a police station. It could also just be a crazy citizen, but the door with the logo again implies that this is an office. We also have this recorder here, which will be used during interviews, and notice once again the ashtray. These pop up quite regularly during the game and the artwork, but there is a huge link here for later. If you're still not convinced, we see more evidence of this in the artwork. In this image we can see a man is clearly conducting an interview or an interrogation. The room setup is exactly how you see every single interrogation room in every single TV show or movie ever. We can see that the man with the hat interviewing this child, we once again see the ashtray, and the hat also turns up in the office that we see in the game. So we have a PI who is important enough to show several times in the artwork, and is even hinted at in the game. Who is this PI? I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? He's the Thin Man. The very next image in the artwork shows the man stood up. This is clearly the Thin Man. Notice how his face is obscured, just like Mono. Looking at more concept art for the Thin Man, we can also see him several times with smoke coming out of his head. This could be a reference to him being a chain smoker. Thinking about the metaphorical sense of the game, a child could easily interpret a chain smoking PI to be monstrous. This would tie into the Nightmares interpretation of the game too. So this is where the broken timeline aspect comes into play once again. Many look at the game as a loop, but perhaps it's more complicated than that. We assume that Mono grows up to be the Thin Man inside the signal tower, but we actually don't know if there wasn't an original Thin Man, one who grew up and worked as a PI in the Pale City, before it was corrupted by the signal. It's possible that the grown-up Thin Man ended up corrupted like everything else, and that explains how there was a Thin Man to start with. So if the Thin Man was a PI, what was he investigating? There are a number of possible explanations, but one just jumps right out at me. He was investigating missing people, but more specifically, missing children. We know that after enough time of being corrupted by the signal, people end up being absorbed or consumed by the TV, leaving nothing but their clothing behind. I'm still convinced that the signal tower took a long time to corrupt the city though. After all, many of the buildings look like they've been decaying for years. There is evidence that people tried to contain the viewers too. We can see that many doors have been boarded up, presumably to keep the viewers away from the people who are still normal. We can also theorize that it took a while for the TVs to be adopted by every household. We see advertisements for TVs, and if the TV signal acted immediately, I doubt so many people would have bought them in the first place. So during the time period where the city started to feel the effects of the corruption, normal people still lived and worked in this city. The Thin Man started to notice a pattern of disappearances across the city as people came to him to report them. After all, PIs very often work on missing people cases, as the police sometimes give up on cases they can't solve, or if it's not seen as an emergency. But there is one piece of evidence that ties this all together, and it is yet another piece of artwork. Amongst the advertisements we can see in the artwork, many of which appear in the game, we see this one. This one looks just like a missing child poster, even down to the details. But note one thing, we never see a child viewer in this game. In fact, aside from the 6 characters from the comics and the game, we see no children at all. Again, the obvious explanation is that the Thin Man is taking them. But why is he taking them? And why is he not taking adults? Very simply, because that was his behaviour before the Pale City fell. Think about it. Pre-corruption Thin Man spent his days tracking down missing children. He searched for them all across the city. If he found them, he took them back to his office for questioning, trying to figure out why they were all going missing. Current Thin Man spends his days tracking down escaped children. If he finds them, he takes them back to the signal tower, although this time they are never seen from again. He's also copying the behaviour you would expect from a PI who was searching for missing children, but once again, it's not quite right. Now, what makes this theory all that much juicier is that if you think about it, it fits in with the loop or broken timeline theory. Why were the children going missing in the first place? Because the Thin Man was stealing them. The Thin Man was on the case, tracking down children that he stole. Just another version of him, perhaps a future version. Then Mono is chased by the Thin Man, and then he becomes the Thin Man. Everything is looped and twisted upon itself. Even further than that, Mono tracks down the glitching remains because once again, that's just in his nature. Mono is just one more form of the Thin Man tracking down and taking children. We could also say he does that with 6 too. He abducts her and attempts to take her back to his office, or in this case, the signal tower, just like the Thin Man does. This distorted timeline can also explain the glitching remains too. If we look at this one, which by the way is incredibly poignant, the Thin Man was searching for missing children, not knowing that one was right under his nose or above his roof the entire time. These remains glitching could be a hint at this child existing in many different timelines. Just as Mono and the Thin Man exist in multiple forms at once, so do these children. The past child who was here before the signal tower corrupted the city, the current one that we see is merely an echo of that, but since it exists in our timeline and the previous timeline, they glitch. This Thin Man theory still fits with my theory on Mono's greatest tragedy and fear. In a previous video, I theorized that Mono's greatest fear was growing up and becoming alone. Well, that fear might have stemmed from the fact that the PI Thin Man was so obsessed with his work, so determined to solve the case that he ended up neglecting his own life and relationships. After all, with the increased rate of missing children, I am sure this PI rarely had a chance to stop working, especially if he felt sorry for the parents who were losing their children and couldn't explain why. We could go just one step further with this theory though. If the Thin Man was investigating the missing children's case, it's possible that there was another cause entirely. The Moor. You see, the ferryman in the comics of the first game was known to take children to the Moor, although we don't know why, since children aren't affected by the hunger. We do know that there are a number of children on the Moor who are held in cages until they are old enough, at which point they are killed and fed to the guests. Perhaps the Thin Man was on the trail of the ferryman. This would explain why we see this picture that looks very similar to him in that room. Therefore, it's even possible that the Thin Man found out about the Moor, perhaps he even travelled there. He snuck aboard, and what he saw shocked him deeply, affecting him so much that he... I've said before that I didn't think that this man was the Thin Man, but what if there are multiple timeline versions of the Thin Man? Once again, we know the timeline is more complicated, perhaps even broken. Now we know there are possibly multiple different Thin Men existing at the same time. What if this Thin Man is just one of many different Thin Men? In fact, we have even more evidence to suggest this. When Six leaves the TV realm in the secret ending, we see her in a room with a guest mask and an advert to the Moor. We never saw the guest masks in the game prior to this, so this could be an entirely different timeline, a different universe, one where things are different, or one where different choices were made. This could explain why in the TV universe no one is hungry, they are obsessed with the TVs instead. It could also explain why so many elements of the timeline don't make sense, seeing Roger's mask in the doctor's workshop for an example. It's possible that Six travelled to another time, another place, or another universe or reality entirely, and in this reality, the Thin Man died rather than getting trapped in a time loop. After all, multiple different timelines and multiple different universes are very closely linked together. For example, the butterfly effect suggests that one tiny little decision can have drastic consequences. For example, a butterfly's wing flap could influence a tornado later on down the line. You see this in media quite often. A lot of films and TV that have time travel will often show how different choices will lead to drastically different consequences, and once again, butterfly theory, we also have a heavy element of moths in this game. Not quite the same, but yet again, in Little Nightmares, everything's just a little bit twisted, isn't it? Either way, the idea that the Thin Man existed before this corrupted Thin Man, and that there are multiple versions of him, has opened up a whole new area for theory crafting, and yet a whole other interpretation of the games. Sure, we see the Moor advertised in Little Nightmares 2, but is it the same Moor? We'll probably never know, but I do think that this theory could tie together so many loose ends, and once again, it just adds to the tragedy of Mono's story. So these have been the hidden dark secrets of the Thin Man. I've really enjoyed making this video, so I hope you have enjoyed watching it. If you have, consider subscribing so you don't miss all of my other theories and all of my other horror content too. We do a lot of different things on this channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.